All right, we're going to pick up now. We're on slide 22, and the topic here is actually using an image in place of one of the default buttons that's created. Now, whenever you create a button on an HTML form, and thus far we've used ones that are automatically created, the look of that button depends on a number of different things. It depends on your operating system, version of your operating system, your browser settings. So I can create a button, not style it, and have it look completely different. It could look like 20 different ways. So anybody who's like a Mac person knows what I'm talking about. Buttons that are on Macs look a little different, right? Yours aren't looking like this, Benjamin, are they? All right. But so one thing that people do like to do is use images in place of the buttons and then make those linkable. So in other words, one of the things that we could do, I don't have an image to pull in, so I'm not going to actually perform this step, but you just simply say the type is image, and then you give it the name, and then notice it also has a source, and just like you would for a regular image file, you indicate where the image is located. Now, generally speaking, I'm not a huge fan of this approach, but it can be useful. Like if you want, like if you're doing like a Star Trek homepage and you want the submit button to look like a Klingon like sword or something like that, you probably have to do it with an image. But if you're just trying to make a button like blue with black text or green like that, you can actually do a lot of it with HTML and CSS. So I would always caution you on using that approach, because you always run into the possibility that what if the image doesn't load, right? Do you want the person not to say check out now, right? You want that to work. So keep that in mind. Now, the other one that we're going to do, and this one's a pretty important one, and this is, believe it or not, this is fairly new, relatively speaking, is creating one that's actually a button. And with a button, we actually, once again, have these opening and closing tags. So you have open button, close button. See how easy that was? Try to do my split screen here again. So this is what I did. Text in between is what goes on the button. A lot of coders these days are preferring this approach. And notice that I can apply to it any one of these attributes. So I could have it be the submit button. I can actually get rid of this and just say type equals submit, and then this button will trigger the action on the form. You can do the same thing with an image button too. So you can make that of type submit and it will work. Well, the button is generic. That's basically it. I mean, and if your question is more of what if I did input type button, it's still a button. The reason that a lot of people are preferring this approach is because the code makes more sense. And then if I'm styling buttons, I can generically apply a style to all buttons. That's one reason, rather than applying it to something with a specific ID. Ultimately, when you're working with this kind of stuff, you're going to find that you're going to get into practices that you like to do. I've just seen like there's a modern, coding movement where a lot of people are preferring to use a button tag as opposed to using an input. Yeah, the behavior is essentially the same. All right, some things that you might also want to add, basically, and you can see they fall into the category of accessibility, are a couple of these elements that can be useful to some degree. Now, there's some practicality concerns here, frankly. I don't use all of them. In fact, let's break them down one by one. Oops, that was going a little fast. So one example, and if I'm fortunate I can just copy this, is where I did email up top here. I'm just going to replace it. All right, so I have my regular input nestled in between two label tags. The text that immediately follows the label and encapsulates the input tells the browser that this label is attached to that input. Have you guys ever gone to a website and you type in a password or a username and it like kind of knows like what your username already is? A lot of times that's because of the label. So your browser identifies the fact that the input field that you're typing into has a label of username. And it's like, oh, username. Well, let's just drop in this one. That's the one you always use. So it can have a positive effect to it. Do you need to use a label? No. In fact, if you look at this other approach, this is kind of our older approach to doing it, where the label tag sits separate from the input, but includes an attribute called for so that we know which input it refers to. Either approach is considered acceptable. Neither approach is required. It's a preference. One of the reasons why you might include it is for the reason I just mentioned, where it might allow a user to kind of accelerate what might be typed into a field. Now, in terms of a desktop, we probably might not think about it a lot, but when somebody's on a handheld, it might be useful, right? Click on the form field, and a little pop-up will, shows you all the common usernames that you use for forms that already have a label called username. A lot of people call things the same thing. So, feel free to do that. The other advantage, of course, to using a label is that you can style it, right? So you can say that everything that's inside of a label tag is green, for example. So that's one other advantage. Here's another one that I'm not a huge fan of using, but it is out there, and that is something called Fieldset. And I'm just going to copy this and drop it in. And it really has a couple different components here. In fact, we could wrap the entire form inside of it. And at the very bottom, just before I close the form, I'll close the tag. And you guys can already see at least in the PowerPoint, what it does is it wraps everything together. And it does create a visual effect, but it also has a secondary effect. The secondary effect is that it groups the things together. So in some cases, that helps radio buttons operate better and checkboxes operate better in a couple of other form fields. They're logically grouped. Once again, you can also style around it. Like you can see, for example, that by default it has a box around it. Doesn't have to. But it also kind of, because it's creating a container, allows you to style it further. So just keep that in mind. Do you have to use it? Absolutely not. Another thing that's kind of helpful, and you guys might already be aware of some of this stuff, But whenever you're operating a form, and this is like way back kind of, computer stuff. Before we had mice, there was an era before people used a mouse with a computer. We just would type at a keyboard if we were lucky to have one. And we were working with form fields. The way we would move from form field to form field, and you can watch me here, is you press the tab key. And if you guys aren't aware of that, any dialog box I would bring up in a browser. So if I went, for example, to save this, not what I wanted to do. Let's do it like that. All right, so here's a dialog box. Right now, what's highlighted? File name. Watch what happens when I press tab. Watch the highlights shift. Where is it now? Right here. Right there. See it? See it pop up? So this is something that's actually kind of handy. Have you guys ever worked on a system where the mouse is broken? You're like, oh no, now what do I do? Quick, go buy a mouse. Now you can actually completely operate a Windows environment with a keyboard. No, it's not fun, but it is possible and sometimes necessary. And the tab key is like one of the key buttons that you press to move around. So just be aware of that as you're working. Now, what we're learning on this slide basically is that you can kind of override the tab index. The tab index typically will follow the order of the fields on the page. Anywhere that a user can do something, see that? So if I'm doing this with the keyboard, you see that Firefox is now highlighted. Now Opera, how do I check it if I don't have a mouse? Space bar. I know you're old school just by saying that, which I appreciate. Same thing here. Can you see the highlights change? Maybe the people only in the video can see it. On this big screen, it's not always as clear. But you can set up a tab index. I'm not going to actually do it. But if you wanted people, when they hit the tab key, to go through in a certain order, you can predefine that. Intro to programming, you guys work with Visual Studio. Chances are you probably learn about tab indexes. At least I hope you do. Another thing that's kind of cool. If you want to be able to directly jump to a specific field on the form, you can also set up an access key. That's kind of cool. That's a relatively new feature as well. It's been around for a little while, but common usage, not very common, but can be useful, right? So if I wanted people to just go right to the email field, they could press the letter E. However, you have to use the control key and the hotkey to move the cursor. So, I mean, I guess that's one that we could play with a little bit. So where's my email field? Way up at the top. Back to the browser, we're going to refresh. All right, just make sure it's refreshed a few times. Now I'm going to Control E. Oh, that didn't work. Click in the page and then do Control E. No, it still didn't work. I ran into this problem once before. The browser already has something for Control E. Problem. All right. How about Control Z? S? V? C? All right. What's a safe letter to use? L. All right, let's refresh again. That's one too. Mac users know that one more than PC people. D? Yeah, 6. I'm also doing a hard refresh here just to make sure. So what letter did I just put in? D? Oh, that's a bookmark. How about Alt-D? No. All right. Can you see why it's not very commonly used? There probably is. There's there's tricks to using this. I don't remember them all off the top of my head, but you can certainly look it up if you're interested. That was fun. All right. So some of the stuff that you can do, of course, with forms, we've learned all the basics, right? You can style any form element using any of the CSS techniques that we've worked with. Borders, padding, background colors, fonts, all that stuff. Anything that you could do anywhere else with CSS, you can do to a form. So for example, they have some stuff here I'm not going to use. But what I will do is I will actually go ahead and create a style section right here. Ideally, you would put this in an external style sheet, but I really don't want to waste the time creating one. So I might do something like and we may as well take a look at the results right away, right? Eh, that's not the best choice. That's where you do, maybe we actually do a hex code here. Oh, wrong direction. Not too bad, you know. But you get the idea here. You can apply, and look, my CSS is even broken and it still worked. You can choose fonts. What else can we do here? Do a little padding. Just made a little space in the box. Yeah, not pretty, but proves the point. I mean, you can even do like I just want to give you ideas. All right. Some other interesting stuff that you can do, and the book didn't talk about this, and I don't know if they will, maybe in later chapters, but you can do stuff like this, placeholder, In that case, you might actually opt to get rid of this. If you look, and where I'm borrowing that from is if you go to a site like Facebook, that's what they do. They just use placeholder text. They don't label their fields. That's kind of a modern approach too. I like that approach. You'll find a way that works well for you. One thing that they're showing in the book here is see how they're trying to make everything line up in columns and rows? That can be a challenge, right? Right justify, left justify, line them all up. So you could do that a couple different ways. In the old days, what we used to do is put all of it into a table. And that's a really good way to align things because it always works. But if you were trying to do it otherwise, and you start doing all these like floats and lefts and all this kind of stuff, I find that complicated. What a lot of people also do, and I'll pick on last name here, is they'll opt to just do a line break and put the label above. That works fine. I really like the placeholder approach, so that's me. And see what happens is once you start typing, it goes away. Another thing that we should probably add here that you should check out is another important attribute called required. And you can just use the word plain, required. What do you suppose that does? That's right. This was submit now. See what it does? That's brand new with HTML5. That is a huge step forward for form processing. All right, back to the PowerPoint. I think you guys get the idea there. We talked a little bit about server-side processing. So basically, in an ideal scenario, you hit that button, we're sending it off to like a program on the server, and it sends an email, or it puts it in the database, or does something programmatically with the information that you've sent. Server-side processing in our program, we don't really formally talk about it, I think, until you get to ASP.NET and PHP, and probably more so in the PHP class. Other thing that's kind of interesting, this is kind of a technology that's been around a long time, but we have what we call CGI. No, it's not like the computer graphics that you guys are thinking of, like special effects in movies. It's called Common Gateway Interface, and it's basically a way that we send information from forms to a server for processing. It can operate with a number of different languages, but the whole process of doing that is called CGI. In the old days, the way that we would make this work is we'd run the form, we'd send off to a CGI script that was usually written in like Perl, older scripting language, and then that would run on the server and trigger things. Now it's a lot more flexible. Any server-side language that you can run on your server, you can trigger through a form. In the ASP.NET, you guys will learn that you'll do ASPX files, the program files. PHP, you'll trigger PHP files. Those do require the server to be present. Here's some of the more popular server-side scripting like file extensions. I just told you about PHP and ASP. ASPX is like the more modern version, the .NET version. When you guys take your Java 2 class, if you're in the web program, we will do some JSP. They also have some other new formats that don't require special file extensions. It's kind of a complicated story, but web files that allow servers to operate straight up programming code, which is pretty powerful. And then here's an older one, Cold Fusion. I know it's still in use. It was popular a while back, and I still know people that are very vested in it. And it is very cool. It's just not very popular. But remember, whenever you're sending information off to a server-side script, that script is executing on the server. The server is required to make it work. Now, when you guys learn your PHP stuff, you'll discover that you can do your PHP stuff right on our servers, and it'll work. And if you don't have a server operating, you will not see your page results. It's a different type of mindset. You guys will get there. Okay, so how do you do that? Here's an example, just procedurally. So step one, the web page invokes server-side processing by form or hyperlink. So you might actually click a link to get there, but usually it'll be a form resulting in some sort of action. The server receives the request, it triggers the script, maybe takes the form data that you've sent and processes it somehow, and then it does whatever it's going to do. Write it to a file, perform some actions, write it to the database, return stuff from the database maybe, and then when it's all done, you'll get some sort of response from the server. Usually it's something you code, so if I trigger a PHP file, for example, to write some information to a database to store it, I'll also write some code that'll come back and say, operation successful, or thank you very much, or now we have your credit card, good luck. Right. But that's the typical cycle. All right. Why do you do this stuff? Database, online ordering, send a web page to a friend, subscribe to a newsletter. You guys are on Facebook all the time and you post stuff. That's what's happening. All right, so if you are actually going to send stuff to a server-side script, you need to have the location of where that script is located. When you guys are going to start authoring PHP and ASP, you're going to be working on stuff that is either on your local machine running a local web server, or more likely connecting to one of our servers like Kronos, and you'll point to a script on the server. Now, that's kind of boring until you get to that point. I mean, we're talking like a semester or so down the road for you guys. So what the author has done is he's actually provided a PHP script that you can connect to. So if you do a contact form, you can use this script, send your information there, and then basically all the script does is it sends back all your stuff. It's not really that exciting, but it is talking to a server, it's being processed, and it's sending back a response. So when you work on the case exercises for Chapter 9, that's one of the steps you're going to have to do. All right? He's got a little list of resources here for websites that offer free server-side processing. Explore at your own will. I'm not a huge fan because I was just write stuff, you know. But if you just want to get that instant satisfaction, here's some resources for you. If you're interested in learning more about these technologies, a bunch of links. Those that are active in this program, you will learn all of this stuff except for Cold Fusion. So these are all things you're going to do in the program. Web developers will do Ruby on Rails. SharePoint people will not. Just something to keep in mind. All right, let's keep moving here. We have not too many more slides left to go. Oh, I see a typo. And another typo too. Another typo too. See how I fixed it? Control-Z fixes that. If you didn't know that. All right. Another type of input, we've been kind of goofing around with this here, but when we put email in up here, notice that the type is text, right? Because email addresses are text. But you can also switch it to type email. This is a new HTML5 thing. So if I type something in that box, and I go to submit it, and it's not an email address, well, okay, all right, fine, I'll do that one too. Okay. It actually validates so that it's in an email format. It's looking for the @ sign, and it's also looking for some letters, plus a dot, plus some more letters. That's a big step forward too. These are things that kind of save us coding in other areas. All right. We also have one that is for doing web addresses. I'm not going to demonstrate all these, just a couple of key ones, just so you guys are aware. But you can set up one that accepts only URLs. So what would go in a URL field? Probably HTTP or HTTPS, right? It probably has to have like .com in there or .something. So it checks against those. It also helps to convert it to a link, which is important. Another one that's cool is for telephone numbers. They have a new style built in for that. That's also, I think, very useful. They also have one now for search text box. That one's actually worth playing with a little bit. Maybe we can put that right up here at the top. That's all I'm going to type. Actually, we should probably do a line break or something. Or maybe we should do placeholder. See a little difference there? A little X that pops up. That's about the most notable change with it. You still would have to add a button or program some sort of a response to a search. But it's designed basically to give you that capability. Also helps to identify it as a different type of object, so that's why it's important. Almost done, folks, almost done. All right, here's another newer concept. I'm not going to actually drop this one in, but it's very much like the select option box, but it has a little bit different usage. So data list control gives you the ability to basically link up, this object with a certain set of data going into a certain area. It's very similar to the select box in terms of appearance, but it's got a little slightly different semantic meaning. Remember we talked about semantics way early on? There's important aspects, especially with HTML5 when it comes to some of these things. All right, let's move on to some fun ones. Here's one where it's a slider. So actually I could just copy all of this code and drop it in. You guys can see what it does. You want to play with it? Those little VTs in there. You guys see these on forums too. Very exciting. I know it seems really dumb, but what happens is by putting this control in here, and this one doesn't have the JavaScript that outputs what the value is, but it's a range from 1 to 100. You can specify that. Okay, other really cool ones. Ooh, look at that spinner control. Where you can click up and down. You've seen those too. This one is huge. When you guys are in our jQuery class, when you're in our ASP.NET class, there's so many classes where we teach the coding approach to doing this stuff, and a lot of times it uses API libraries that we have to pull in, or jQuery libraries that we have to pull in, and then just be able to very simply drop something onto a form like this. Do you see that? Not only that, but you can click the box and it just gives you all this stuff automatically. This, I mean, this is nothing short of amazing for anybody that's been in the field like me for a long time, where it's like, oh my God, I can just do that and it works, and it looks good. It's huge. It's really a huge development. So, and it looks impressive too, right? There was a lot of hard work that went into that. All right. Not to be outdone, there's also the color picker thing, which leverages the built-in color selection tool for your operating system. So in Windows, it'll look like this, and Mac, it'll look like their color picking tool. But hey, what a great way to choose a color. Wow, so I could write an HTML page that generates a color. How do you suppose that color value is passed? No, well, the value is passed as usually a hexadecimal number, the color code. But yeah, you can manipulate it with JavaScript, absolutely. So isn't that cool? You could write your own color picker. All right. Ultimately, folks, this will take a little bit of playing with and honestly just scratching the surface of what forms can do. Those of you that are moving into the Web 2 class that are in the SharePoint program, we go into depth a little bit deeper with some of this stuff, but we will revisit forms in just about any class that has to do with HTML, which is just about every class you're going to take. Forms are one of the primary ways that we interface with users and are very important in how you lay them out and how you design them. And then obviously the scripting that goes behind them is important too, but very, very important feature in HTML. All right, folks, that ends this chapter.